Good morning,
Good
and
morning.
welcome to another episode of Ask Us Anything with special Intern Edition. So, Derek and Nate are away, so that's fun.
Yeah.
And so, my name is Lily Souza, and I am the Global Missions Intern. And we have Sam DeVore. Sam, tell us a little
Sam
bit.
DeVore, Pastoral Apprentice.
I love that.
It's a great name.
It is. It really is.
The theological world really has just got a patent on these names. You got Masters of Divinity, Pastoral Apprentice.
Yeah,
We're a little bit arrogant sometimes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to see how cool you guys can sound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I did say my password yesterday on one of my things is Sam is the coolest. So really just embracing the titles with that. Yeah.
Humility is
Yeah.
your number one gift.
Lily, how are you doing today?
I'm doing swell, you know?
Yeah.
Just doing swell. Getting ready for
Yeah, we leave for
Japan,
Japan on Saturday.
which is really fun
Yeah.
and exciting.
Yeah.
I can't wait to speak a bunch of Japanese that I don't know.
Yeah. Sweet.
Yeah.
Well, did anyone send in questions this week?
They did. Yes. All right, let's jump into those.
Sweet.
Question number 1, which I love how this is phrased, by the way, so whoever sent it, love it. Did those guys in Genesis really live to be more than 900 years old? Were their years different than our years? So 365 times 24 hours a day.
Yeah. That's a really great question, and it's super fun to read about too. There's a lot of different opinions, scholarly camps. I'm actually going to start by talking about I mentioned in the sermon on Sunday that the genealogy was a linear genealogy, and what that meant is that it only tracked one person in each generation instead of being what's called a segmented genealogy, which is exhaustive and would talk about all the different siblings. And with a linear genealogy, some people would say that it intentionally skips generations in order to prove a point or to make literary emphasis. So, other biblical examples of this would be in Ruth, there's a genealogy that ends with David, and that genealogy only like puts in the heavy hitters of the Bible. So, it skips people just to show that David is the fulfillment of this awaited promise. And then another one, probably the most famous one, is in Matthew 1, where it talks about Jesus as the fulfillment of all of these Old Testament promises. So it shows 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the exile, and then 14 generations from the restoration of the exile to Jesus. And we know from Kings and Chronicles that there's actually way more than 14 generations, but because 7 times 2, they want to show Jesus as a fulfillment, so they skip them. So we have a lot of biblical precedent for genealogies that aren't complete as we would see it, but the author is telling us a story, is doing something intentional, and so they skip generations. And that has a lot to do with the question of did they really live that long? Because some people would say um, there's an ancient Near East like connection called the Sumerian Kings List, and they list people and say that they lived X number of years, and some of them live like 18,000 years. And so you're like, did they really live 18,000 years? And in that case, they definitely didn't. The Sumerian Kings List, it refers to specific people, but then it says their reign or like the reign or the era of or the dynasty of this person lasted 18,000 years. And so a lot of people will read Genesis 5 and they'll say that um, these people were real people. So like Methuselah is a real guy, but he himself didn't live 900 years or whatever it says, 879 years. Um, but his rule or his dynasty or the era of Methuselah lasted that long. So some people will say it's that. If you think the genealogy is complete, which there's a good amount of people that do, so you definitely can hold to that position, then what you would say is they actually did live that long. And the reason they were able to live that long is because sin has just entered into the picture. And so there's not as much danger, there's not as much chaos with the created order. We know that the original intention was for humanity to live forever in the garden. And so, just as sin slowly enters, it takes time for the age of humans to go down to what we have today.
Cool.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would want to live 900 years, but that's
Definitely not after sin.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so question number 2. Who is Cain's wife? Where did she come from? And who was he afraid of?
Yeah. So, if you'll remember in Genesis 4, right after he kills Abel, he is really afraid that someone's going to kill him too. He asks God, and God gives him this mark of protection. And so far in Genesis, we've only heard of God, Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel. And so you might ask, like, if only Adam and Eve are left after he kills Abel. Like, who's he afraid of? Who's going to kill him? Why does he have to run? Why does he build this city for protection? And what the text suggests, I think, is that there are other people in the world at this point. And so, again, much ink has been spilt over this, and probably some blood, with people arguing too. Um, but the main camps would be one, Cain marries his sister or a distant cousin. Like, it's been several generations, and it says in Genesis 5 that Adam and Eve had many other kids, and so maybe he's married a distant cousin after 3 or 4 generations, and then he goes and builds this city. That would be one. But then you run into the problem, like, what about incest? We know that that's not good in the Mosaic law. So is this just like a necessary evil to get us to that point? I think it gets a little dicey with that. So I don't necessarily embrace that view. The other one, and this one's really interesting, is that even though Adam and Eve were the first humans, they're not necessarily the only humans that God creates. So he breathes life into Adam and Eve, but perhaps there are other humans on the earth too. And so we get this story of Adam and Eve and their priestly role in the garden, but it's possible that there were other humans around that God creates in a similar way. And so by the time Cain kills Abel, there are other people around to be able to then potentially kill Cain. And then he finds a wife, he goes to the city, and you assume that if he's building a city, there's people to inhabit the city. So there's been some multiplication at this point. Another one that is probably the most interesting, I had a professor, Gordon Hugenberger, who posed this view, is that Adam and Eve actually aren't the first like Homo sapiens. They're just the first ones to have the breath of God breathed into them. And so the human species, you could say, exists before Adam and Eve, but they were not made in the image of God. They didn't have any relationship with Yahweh. And then with Adam and Eve, he calls them out of that species, breathes his life into them, his spirit into them, and they become his priestly representatives in the garden. And at that point, that's when the whole biblical narrative starts. And so people who hold to that view would say Cain just married another Homo sapien who wasn't made in the image of God. That one gets a little weird, and all of these are completely conjecture. We really can't get much from the biblical text, other than there were other people at the time that Cain kills Abel and then leaves to build a city. So it is kind of up in the air. There's not a whole lot of like, this is definitely what it was. But I think we can say that there were other people when Cain leaves, when Cain kills Abel and has to go and build a city. Who his wife is tough. I tend to lean towards the view of God had created other humans too, because I think that gets around the incest problem. But how did he create them? Why aren't they in Genesis? Those are tough questions that we don't really know. But what we can say with certainty is that the original reader of Genesis either wouldn't have cared to ask that question, it wouldn't have been on their mind, they wouldn't have minded, or they would have known the answer. And so the narrative didn't need to talk about it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Kind of mind blowing. All right, so the last question we have for today. When did the species divide into races?
Yeah, that's another really good question. My understanding of this is that God creates Adam and Eve, and humanity is kind of localized at this point. And so as they multiply, they stay rather localized. And so they're of one race, essentially. And then you get to the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, and people at that point are still all talking in the same language. And they're trying to build this tower up to heaven, and God realizes the idolatry that's taking place here. And so what he does is he scatters them by making everyone then speak different languages. And so they're forced to go into their own little tribes, which that means migration to different places. And my understanding of like skin color and race is that it actually comes a lot from climate. And so if you move to a more tropical or a hotter climate, your skin complexion gets darker as generations go on. I actually heard from Bill Nye. I remember this from elementary school. Like, if I took a group of white people and we moved to Africa, and for 5 generations we only married each other and had kids, then we would start to like see darker skin tones within 5 generations. So all that to say, I think that the race comes in only when God scatters the people with a mix of languages and they move to different climates. That's where I think race comes into the picture.
I actually always thought that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good. All right, that's all the questions we have for today.
You don't have any more questions?
I don't. Sorry. um, yeah, no, those are really great. That's I think like it's a really hard thing to ponder about, just because you don't know, and it's always like very, um, yeah, you always get very into like what could it be, and I guess it just doesn't. Some of the things it just doesn't really that important to our salvation.
Yeah, exactly. I think the questions we're asking are a lot different than the questions the original reader would have asked. And so we wonder, and we have this curiosity about like, why did this happen this way? Or why doesn't the Bible talk about this? But I think we can have confidence and assurance that we're told the things that we need to know. And there's a reason that some details are withheld and some details are included. And rather than lament the ones that we don't know, I think it's better to marvel at the great picture that we have been given in Genesis.
Yeah. Well, I guess the one question I do have about the race thing
Mm-hmm.
was like, because I know some people think that like the mark, right, of Cain had to do with that,
Mm-hmm.
right, with race. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so the Hebrew word used for that, I read this in a commentary last week, is pretty general, pretty
Mm.
ambiguous. It suggests that there is a physical mark on Cain, but we don't know if that's like an X on his wrist or could it be skin color change. There's really like we're just guessing at this point,
Okay.
so I don't think it's that useful to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sam.
Wow. Thanks, Lily.
Yeah. Well, thank you for tuning in to Ask Us Anything with Center Grace. And I won't, but hope you guys will tune in next week with Nate.